Hello and welcome everyone to part 3 of the social equity series, Intersectionality, based on the book, Achieving Social Equity. This presentation is produced by the AMPA cohort at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado in Denver. My name is Danielle Holmes, and I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters today. We have Dr. John Ronquillo, who is moderating the panel discussion. He's an associate professor and serves as the Social Equity Task Force co-chair here at CU Denver. On the panel, we have the author of Chapter 5 at the Intersectionalities of Identity, Dr. Anthony Starke. We are pleased to have Dr. Francisca, aka Frankie, Angulo-Olaiz, the VP of Community Engagement at Mile High United Way, and Belinda Hearn, the Program Manager for People Engaged in Raising Leaders, a community action program in Boulder County. And without any further delay, I turn the event over to our moderator, Dr. John Ronquillo.
Thanks so much, Danielle, and thanks to everybody who's joining us over this noon hour to talk about another component that is just so critical in terms of social equity. Another author of a chapter in this volume that has highlighted the work of a lot of folks here at CU Denver as we talk about intersectionality, and we're so grateful that Belinda and Frankie are joining us as well, and we're looking forward to the discussion today. As Danielle said, my name is Dr. John Ronquillo. I also have a chapter in the book, and it has been a volume that has been talked about at length, has been integrated into curricula, and we are looking forward to taking a deeper dive into Dr. Starke's chapter that talks about intersectionality. And we're looking forward to a robust discussion with everybody on the panel today. So to kick us off, I want to start with Anthony and ask him the first question. As the author of the chapter that we're discussing today, please define for us, what is the meaning of intersectionality, and specifically in the context of public administration?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Ronquillo, and thank you all for being here with us this fine afternoon. I am excited to share this platform with my fellow panelists. And I would also like to acknowledge my co-author, who is not here on the panel with us, Dr. Nuri Heckler, who is at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, but is near and dear to the heart of many of us here at CU Denver as an alum of our PhD program. I want to begin by saying that Dr. Heckler and I were very fortunate to contribute to this book, and especially to write this chapter. It is a labor of love in terms of understanding the role of intersectionality within public administration. For those of you who are unfamiliar with me or my research, and I don't expect anyone to be a fan of mine per se, but I will begin by saying that my upbringing and my background from a disciplinary standpoint is not traditional PA. I did not follow what is most common in the political science to public administration track. My background is actually in clinical psychology and human services counseling. And during my experiences as a practitioner, I was fortunate enough to work with a number of different folks. And
I think the rest of us are live. Let's pause a little bit and see if Anthony rejoins us. I know we are definitely living in a world of spotty internet sometimes. And he was on such a great tear with that answer too. Well, let's see if he comes back. Let's go ahead and keep going. And why don't we go ahead and focus now. Frankie, Dr. Angulo-Olaiz, why don't we shift the question over to you first, and then we'll go over to Ms. Hearn. How does intersectionality show up in the work that you do for our Colorado communities?
Sure. Well, thank you, and hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I think it's really exciting what we're talking about. And so, I think for me, how it shows up is me as a leader, and first and foremost, right? So, as Latina first generation, I'm a cultural medical anthropologist, and so combining my training with my lived experience. And then in the setting of a nonprofit and learning about, what the nonprofit does and then how to do our work, it's been some great wins and been some challenges. And so for intersectionality for me is like working with a team also of, we certainly have a diversity of people at Mile High United Way, but on the team itself, currently we have many Latinas, right, who, like myself, who grew up in poverty. And I think when we go out and work out in the community, you know what it is. You can relate to people. You know how to listen. You know how to build trust, and those things take a lot of time. And I think that when you're trying to do your work, you're trying to be responsive. You're trying to listen and do things very differently than perhaps the institution that you come from. And I think for me, you know, that intersectionality is like, how do you bring all that to the fore, and how do you deal with those tensions? And I think that, you know, that's something that, you know, I certainly don't have an answer to. I've been doing, you know, on this journey for most of my life. But I think one of the key things is, how do you bring your entire self to the table? And how do you create a table, you know, create this table with those that you're serving, and listen to them and say, okay, how does that affect our work? How does our work look like in reflection to what they need? And I think that that's always in the, you know, the kind of in the back of my brain. That's the lens that I use. That's the lens that I train my staff to use. But also that's how I contribute to the leadership at Mile High United Way. Like, how do we really think this? Because like many institutions, we have a certain way of looking and thinking of things. And we did contribute to this, you know, structural inequality. And how do you then not just deconstruct, I know we use that word a lot, but really stop and think, how do you rethink how you do your work and how you show up? And how do you, you know, co-create a table in which those you serve actually have a say, and how you utilize and mobilize your resources in your institution? How do they have a say of that? And so for me, when I think of intersectionality, like, how do I do all of that and be me, and be true to the values that, you know, and my frame of, you know, it's more than just a frame, it's just, you know, how I see things, because I am Latina, first generation from Los Angeles. It's always a challenge, I would say.
That's fantastic. I mean, everything you said, I thought, in particular, you're mentioning of the journey, right? That this is a process sometimes, and it's something that we continue to work on, as opposed to just putting out a product, right? And I think you encapsulated that so well. Belinda, Ms. Hearn, we would love to transition to you and learn a little bit more about your work in Boulder. How does intersectionality pop up in your work, and how do you work within it, around it? Talk to us.
I think this is a question that I ask myself every day, and that I have to speak on every day, to not just the audience that I connect with, but also to myself personally. Being in a place like Boulder, where I'm reminded constantly, not only by the community that I'm being of service to, but the organization that I in relationship with, I'm reminded that you are 1.2% of the population. How can you connect with this community? And I think that takes me back to the humanity that is within me, first off, and me connecting. I am a Black woman in this realm and in this reality, and I see things from a very correlative perspective. And I may not be Latina, but I do understand certain struggles. I do understand the impact of what this society, and especially this place or this community that I seek to serve, says about me. I think when I show up with authenticity and the desire to really connect, to collaborate, and to also honor the fact that I truly believe this to my core, community members are an asset, and they know what they need. They are the subject matter experts, and we have to look at it from the perspective of not telling them what they need, but being present and being a tool to assist them and be in their toolbox to work in collaboration. So that's what I seek to bring. I seek to show up, to let them know that I'm there in solidarity, to get them to move forward, because as we know, any system that is not built equitably from the beginning, as we roll out and we go back and we pull back these layers and we talk about this equity, it's going to continue to perpetuate those same systems of inequality, of non-inclusion. So in every day, I have to remind myself why I'm here, why I'm serving, that they are the asset. I am the tool, and us coming together, we can bridge some bridges. And I'm going to say this, and some people may be taken back by this. I'm not seeking to have people understand. I'm seeking to build bridges with communities, because if a community builds the bridge they need, the people will come and travel through it. Everybody is eventually going to travel that bridge. And that's what we have to see when we're working with communities. I was in a space last night doing one of my boards and commissions training, and somebody was talking about how they wanted to go in the community and help, but they wanted to go do surveys. It's beyond a survey. Get down, have conversation, go to coffee shops, get on Facebook, get in the spaces where they are and truly connect. And when you see that connection and you have those conversations, that's how we can move forward and continue to move. But you have to move and work at the same time that we're trying to talk about these intersectionalities.
Absolutely. And I think that your example, metaphor of building bridges, right? That's what allows us to traverse potentially rough waters sometimes, right? And when we build those bridges, we're able to connect on better levels. And I appreciate everything that you said. One of the things that I also appreciated that you mentioned was authenticity and sort of that individual value that each and every one of us brings to the table. And both of you have sort of alluded to it and spoken to it a little bit. But I'd like to dig in a little bit more on the aspect of intersectional identities, right? And in particular, how it intersects with structural inequality. And so, Frankie, maybe if we could go back to you, help us understand why it's important to understand these intersectional identities within that element of structural inequality.
Well, I think, hearkening back to what Belinda was saying, right? I mean, most of us do work in institutions that are not, that are inequitable. And so you really do have to always think, okay, so what's my role in really challenging that? How do I help take this apart? How do I help, question it? And those things are never easy. And so I think when I think about, so it's always like questioning, always asking questions and observing. And what is it that I'm observing in myself, but also in my community? Because I think oftentimes people are quick to try to go out into the community and figure something out, right? And talk, about equity or structural inequality. But really that journey begins on a personal level, on a very personal level. Because oftentimes I think the institutions, a lot of nonprofits kind of in that nonprofit sector world, even just the perspective that often a lot of us come from, and that, we're trying to solve for poverty. Well, do you know what the root cause of that is? Did you ever stop and really think about what the root cause, and that how do we get away from that charity model and instead go to the asset-based model, right? How, again, we are in service to people and to our communities. And so always asking that question is like, did I ask? It's not about asking the right questions. It's like, did you ask a question? Are you always asking questions? And the hardest thing is to ask about something that is so normalized that you wouldn't even think to ask. And and there's no easy answer to that, but to surround yourself with people like who are always questioning, and sometimes it's something as simple as, why is this apple green? Well, it's, and you get into this whole kind of discussion, and I'm not talking about philosophical here. I'm talking about really getting into what is it that I see and why do I see it? And I often, talking to people who are like, I really want to do something in the community and those poor people, and oh my gosh, you should see the way they treat their children. And it's just an easy conversation that people have, and you're like, oh, you kind of, and you're just like, well, let's talk about what you think you're seeing or what you think because it's been normalized. And how do we begin to kind of, as I say, peel back the onion and constantly, because yes, that onion, it should do more than make you cry. It should make you mad, and it's like, okay, I think this is the way, and there's no silver bullet to this. And again, with me, when I working within, at my organization, is like, how do I get people to rethink literally, why is it that we as an institution do the things that we do? Start there before you think that you're going to go out and save the world, because sometimes that world doesn't necessarily need saving.
That's a great point. Thank you so much, Frankie. Powerful words, powerful like that onion, right? You peel those layers back and you see the power that it provides. But I appreciate a lot of the context that you added, and we're happy to welcome Dr. Starke back because contrary to what you said, Anthony, you have a lot of fans on here, so it's a good thing that you're back. And before we transition from the question that I just asked, before we go back over to Belinda, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to sort of flesh out that first question that we had asked you in terms of, to define the meaning of intersectionality. I think we're getting to a lot of important points of it, how it intersects with us in our organizations, in our lives. But for more context, as we dig deeper into the topic, we'll toss it back over to you to finish out that definitional attribute that you were giving us.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Great. Okay, I'll try to be short. I don't know what happened with that power surge. But essentially, as Dr. Heckler and I understand, and as you write about and continue to investigate intersectionality within public administration, we're questioning and investigating the ways in which our multiple identities intersect and the ways in which public institutions and public organizations and public policies continue to reinforce those social identities. It's really interesting to me when we do this work, as I mentioned very briefly before I was cut off earlier, that my professional experiences come from the world of mental health and the world of human services. And in that work, as a practitioner, I was trained to help folks cope with daily living. In practice, what I found is that many of the clients that I work with, whether they be incarcerated, whether they be battling substance abuse or dealing with mental health issues or youth and adolescents, many of the folks that I work with were very aware of their social setting. They knew how to cope with their environment. The problem wasn't the individual. The issues were unresponsive institutions. And so as we continue to delve into the historicity of public administration as a discipline, we find very quickly that this has been a white masculine field. And while I don't get into much of that in terms of organizational structures, if you are interested in those things, Dr. Heckler does an amazing job of conducting research that looks at the ways that policies and practices reinforce whiteness and masculinity, from things such as telework previous to or prior to COVID-19, to the ways in which we are hiring and promoting and selecting and even recruiting individuals and working with our constituencies. For me, on the other hand, intersectionality is really about the lived experience, that each and every one of us is extremely different, that we come to this present moment with so many different experiences, with so many different viewpoints, as my fellow panelists was just kind of exploring in that moment. And so a lot of this work is questioning how have those experiences shaped our policies, how have they shaped the ways in which we understand policy problems or social problems, and the ways in which we understand or construct solutions to those issues. And we find that without a true intersectional framework, there are so many facets of our society and our population that are being left out of these discussions, that are left out of these policy interventions, or that are being disparately impacted by the decisions of those in power, those dominant groups to make those decisions. And so as a field of study and as a field of practice, we really try to understand those things and then begin to dismantle them as best we can. And so I'm really also looking forward to not just being a scholar on this panel, but also being a fellow participant in the sense of learning from our practitioner panelists here to see the ways in which these lived experiences, the ways in which these social identities present themselves in their work and in their practice.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Anthony. We're glad that you're back with us and that you were ready to hop right in there with that definition. It adds a lot of context and value to our discussion and to what Frankie and Belinda have talked about within their respective roles, their locations, and their lived experiences. And again, I think what you've provided is a lot of validity to that authenticity component that Frankie was talking about just now. So Belinda, we're going to go back to you with that same question in terms of why it's important to understand. And now that we've got a little clarity around the definitional aspect of intersectionality, in your own experience, why do you feel that it's important to understand intersectional identities in the face of structural inequality?
I definitely, I love what Frankie said, and I love what Anthony came back in here and said. It blew me away, and it also made me think about how it connects to what I say a lot in my mind, and sometimes I may not know how to put it in word, about charity and about all these different identities. And it brought me back to the thought of, we talk about intersectionalities, and in these institutions that we work for, these organizations, we continue to use these same formats and same structurals and organizational theories that have been applied historically over the years that were never created for the people in which many of our organizations serve anyway. And we continue to use those things, and we perpetuate these systems. And when we look at these intersectionalities, we try to box people into these boxes. We try to say, okay, well, if you need rent assistance or this assistance or that, or you need language line services, then you have to make this income and you have to do this. But aren't we perpetuating those same things that were never created in the first place? So we talk a lot about deconstruction, and I appreciate that we do overuse that term too much, but we do not talk about utilizing another way, or as one of my allies in the community, Latin American Latino community always tells me, sneak in and restructure on your own. It is being intentional, it is being active, and it is being engaged, staying in connection and allyship with others, but sneaking it in to look at applying this work that we do differently. We don't do that. We use the same forms, the same surveys, the same things, and we come up with the same answers. And then we box the community that we're supposed to be in conjunction with in. People can be multiple things. Let's help them not to be multiple numbers or multiple disenfranchised people because they're Black and in poverty, or they're transgender and in poverty, or they're this and in that. We have to truly be attentive to the work that we do when we talk about intersectionality, and remember that it is okay for these people to be multiple people, places, and things, but let's try to get them in different arenas and get out of the box. It is okay for us to want to give to somebody's organization, but take that charity mindset away, because that builds a relationship of, I'm gonna come in and tell you what you need in your community. Now I'm gonna come in and show you how. I'm gonna be the tool, you are the asset, and we're gonna work together to build what you need. Because we have to get away from talking about it and be about it, and we have to get away from not acknowledging how much of an asset the community is. You could not go into anybody's grandmother's kitchen in here and tell them what they needed in their refrigerator. You could come and say, Grandma, here you go. I'm going to give you this gift card. I'm going to give you this money. Grandma's going to go pick out her own groceries. We have to get, and I don't know any other way to put it, we have to get back to the very simple identity of, this is not a, I got to have you. We got to have our community, and we have to get up off our butt and be about our business.
Belinda, I love that so much. I think that all of that resonates so well with all the panelists. And in my own role in the past several months as the co-chair of the Equity Task Force, so much of what you said has rang true in our own university community. And I think a lot of what you said leads well into the next question. And if you're okay, we'll just start right back in with you. Let's examine the workplace explicitly. You know, when we spend so much of our lives working, so much of our lives in an organization that has various goals and objectives that we're trying to achieve, when we're on those pathways, when we're part of our teams or our organizational units, how does intersectionality play out in the workplace? How have you seen it play out in your workplace in particular?
I see it quite often because, like I say, I'm the 1.2%, and I'm reminded, on one hand, you're a leader, but on the other hand, you are in need somehow. So I bring this experience, I bring my faith and my desire to connect, but I have these systems that have been constructed in my organization, and I have these people telling me that you can go and be about your business and your work. but somehow there needs to be like some monitoring of how much work you do and how much of the connection you make in the community. Because we can't get away from traditional practices that this organization may have done in the past. You know, I'm just going to be honest. I think it goes back to, I came from a very different looking landscape than Boulder. I moved here from Metro Atlanta. I've worked in DC and Maryland, so my perspective was totally different. And also I had a community, I grew up in poverty. I had a community where people who had nothing told me that I was something. I had a grandmother who only finished second grade education, but she continually told me to get educated. So I did not come from a history or a lineage of scholars. I just came from a lineage of people who fit these intersectional identities, as our society says, that saw the capacity in themselves to input something in me. And so since I know who I am, as I go in and I do this work, I have to support my colleagues and help support them in understanding. I have to be kind and vigilant to educate them, because so many of them are not educated. So many times people who do this work hurt other people. And so many times people who do this work are not traveled. And when I say travel, I don't mean like you've been to these different continents and places and things. I mean, you're not traveled in your understanding of truly what poverty means or looks like. Poverty in Boulder looks different than poverty in Southwest Atlanta and the SWATs. Poverty in Boulder looks different than what it looks like in DC or Little 5 Points in Atlanta. So it's just being mindful that as I'm acknowledging all this intersectionality in the people that I work with and the people that I am in collaboration with or allies, it's also remembering it in myself. It's also remembering when it shows up in my biases and checking myself and my expectation from, honestly, like Frankie said earlier, we have this expectation of what we can do for the community and how we can change it or impact it. I have to check myself, because my bias may have me acting like I'm Superwoman, and that's not what I'm here for. So it's definitely reminding myself, and also when I'm in these spaces, to learn and to take and to acknowledge where I got it from, but to pass on the wisdom that I gained from you all, because that's what inner threads us all in this work that we want to do in the community.
Awesome. Thank you, Belinda. Yeah, that's so many key points there. And I think education is one that is big. I think sometimes a lot of us have different views on the active mechanism of people should educate themselves, but I think it's good of you to be proactive and to help people understand where you're coming from, where we all come from. And I think that's a really great way to encapsulate how intersectionality plays out in our workplaces. I want to transfer over to Frankie now to ask her the same question. How has intersectionality played out in the workplace in your experience, and maybe in particular there at the United Way?
Mm-hmm. Well, Belinda, you are a superwoman. Women of color are superwomen, and we have to remind ourselves that. Because I think that when you talk about the workplace, very many things that Belinda was saying, right? We are leaders. But when something like someone says the code word of executive presence, suddenly we're not leaders, because we don't show up the way we're expected to show up. Someone asks us to be authentic, but when we do, you're being harsh. You're too strong. You're too direct. And, you know, like Belinda, yeah, I grew up in LA. There's a lot of Latinos, but especially Mexicanos, right? We don't know what it is to be a minority. I didn't grow up with that sense. You know, I walked the streets with my head high, and what? I don't understand what you just said. And when you grow up in a large, like Belinda, in a metropolitan area where you have all kinds of people playing, not just Latinos in California, right? You've got everybody from around the world, and everyone's always challenging. And sometimes it can be chaotic, but it's a creative chaos, right? And it's a beautiful thing. And then, you work in these institutions where everything's, in a very clean box. Be your authentic self. executive leadership or executive presence. Here's what we think it is. And when we don't fit in that box, then you're talking about pay parity. Well, where is it? You're talking about equity and people, that's everyone's on the bandwagon. Well, some of us have been doing it for a heck of a long time, long before equity was a cool word. And so that does show up, all the time. And then you're trying to figure out, well, what is my work in the community? Because if they don't understand me within this context, then how do we best serve those who we say we're going to serve? There's this huge disconnect. The way we even tell stories about those we serve. Like, that's not our story. Let's start with empowerment. We're not, have we been traumatized by this historical, and structural inequality, racism, sexism, all the isms? Yeah, sure. Yeah. But that's not who we are. Provide those opportunities for empowerment. And this is why I started off with Belinda, like, yes, we are superwoman, because we've got to do that for ourselves, and we got to hear it every day. Because there's no one else is going to do that for us. Because we got to come back in and help our organizations really break out of that box. But if you're working in institutions like all of us are, who have been around for a long time, that's a tough thing. And so again, it's like, how do you do all these things at the same time? Don't ask me to be me when you're not ready to hear me. I would super appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you, Frankie, so much. Powerful, thoughtful words. And as I think about what you said, as we've, and Anthony, Dr. Starke is a member of the Equity Task Force. He's been an integral part of the work that we've done. One of the things that I've said is we don't want to move the needle. We want to smash the machine. We want to create new parameters where this is a more equitable way of being, equitable workplaces, and to move beyond the hype around that word and not having it just be a buzzword, but to have it be a lived experience and action. And we've said the word empowerment several times. That's powerful. We want to empower our people, and I think both of you have really exemplified that. We want to make sure that Anthony comes back to this question as well too, and certainly has a lot of experiences that he can draw from in terms of the professional experience he mentioned before he went into his academic career, but I'm sure also in terms of his research, but also as professors at a university. We know what kind of interesting organizations universities can be. Let's round out this question. How does intersectionality play out in the workplace? How has it played out for you here at CU Denver?
CU Denver, my experiences here have been very interesting given the fact that I moved here just months before the pandemic. So, but I will say that in the academy writ large, one of the things that I've seen, and I appreciate Belinda's comments earlier about the importance of education and seeing yourself in these spaces and recognizing where you come from. I teach a managing diversity course here at CU Denver, and in our last module, one of the kind of key takeaways that my students had from understanding the relationship between diversity and society and vice versa is that for someone in an unprivileged group, systems have to almost work perfectly in order for you to see the justice that you are promised in many of our founding documents, right? And in higher education, one of the things that I've found in my experience is that there is the images that I've seen in my own lived experiences and the lived experiences of my clients and the lived experience of many of my students are not represented within our organizations and within our institutions, especially higher education institutions. And so I find it really interesting that for me in my personal journey, to get to this space, as Belinda talked about, you have to kind of travel on your own to learn and educate yourself on these topics, that you fight so hard and you work so hard to get to a place in an organization where you feel as though you're seen, only to get there and recognize that nothing around you looks as you look. And so you have to spend a lot of time creating those spaces. And being authentic is emotional labor. Being authentic can cause cognitive dissonance, but it's something that for people who are in marginalized or traditionally oppressed groups, you don't have that luxury. I tell the story, one of my favorite shows is Blackish. And on a recent episode, Dr. Rainbow Johnson had a revelation of what it would have meant in her career had she not have to have been the first Black woman to do these things. Had she, what does it mean to be a great doctor, let alone like the first great Black doctor or anesthesiology in this field? And I think about that in terms of our workplaces and how for so many of us that come from these positions that don't have privilege, how we don't have the luxury of deciding when we can promote or fight for equity or when we can't. Silence is not an option for us. And so thinking about those things and thinking about how you show up and the ways that you show up that are both healthy and constructive to your identity and to who you are and affirming to your ethos, while at the same time trying to make sustainable change in the environment around you can be difficult. And what I love, and I'll throw it back to the book for a second, is that when we were asked to write this chapter that many of you have read, what I love about the book is how we not just talk about the issues, but we also try to point to solutions. And Dr. Heckler and I really had a discussion about what are some of the solutions that are available to us, or what are some of the alternatives and strategies that are available to us to combat intersectionality. And in it, we decided that we could talk about, changing organizational policies and including, this verbiage and those types of things. Dr. Heckler is a lawyer, so the wording is always very important. But at the same time, we recognize that it requires more than that. And so it's weird at times when you're in a classroom, a public administration classroom, you're talking to students about radical hope and transcending identity and what those things mean. Because from a disciplinary standpoint, I remember being introduced to this field with Rosenblum's three kind of perspectives on public administration, right? Like you have the political, the legal, and the managerial. And the entire time I'm thinking, where's the sociological? We don't come to any of this without again, as I mentioned earlier, historicity. I was in a session last week that was something similar to this. And one of my panelists is a emergency management scholar. And she talked about how natural disasters, there's nothing natural about a disaster. Like if you think about the ways that infrastructures are created and those types of things, but policy decisions that we ourselves have made and those that have come before us all shape the world around us. And we need to begin to unpack that and recognize that those viewpoints, while as my fellow panelists talked about, they may have been delivered to us as being this normative and the right way to approach this work or whatever it may be, but recognizing that there's still so much work to be done in this space, and what that work requires of each of us and what that looks like in our workplaces is very different depending on those lived experiences, and that none of us are exactly the same. And so how do we begin to unpack that in a way that does not, again, have negative impacts for groups not like ourselves, right? And so thinking about the ways that we shape our work environment, thinking about the ways that we respond to our clients, thinking about the way that we respond to our students, thinking about the way that we work with our coworkers are all informed by our social identities, about the ways that we have been acculturated and assimilated into these organizations. And it requires the work, right, to be able to, as we talked about earlier, time and time again, unpacking that. But what do you do once you finish unpacking that? Do you sit in it, or do you find radical hope? Do you find you use Black love as a mechanism for moving these things forward? And so I think pushing beyond some of our disciplinary boundaries, thinking through some of the more normative approaches that we've used in the past, and really recreating the future that we want to see requires empathy. It requires an understanding of these issues. It requires a real love for humanity and the work that you're doing, because if not, you can really easily get burnt out trying to do this work, especially when you place in organizations where it's so siloed, right? Where you are expected as the individual of color, as the minoritized individual, you are expected to lead the fray and do all of this work to change a dynamic system that you really have not contributed to its infrastructure, right? And so it requires a lot of work, it requires a lot of thinking, but I think it also requires a lot of self-care that we don't talk about, and the work of social equity and moving the needle forward in terms of our intersectionality.
Fantastic, thank you. Such rich context and good for the discussion, Anthony. I think, you know, as I mentioned before, you've been such an instrumental part of this equity task force at the university, where there's a lot of hope for us to be more intentional about what it means to be intersectional beings, what various labels we wear. I always joke sometimes that I have a lot of labels that I wear, but some of them don't always stick. And, you know, sometimes they stick more than others do at different points in time. Sometimes our identities are reflected in different ways at different points in time. I think all of you have added such great context to this. But I want to ask one last question of all of you before we turn to the audience and some of the questions that they have. We have a couple of good ones that have come in, and I want to make sure that we have time to address them. In particular, one of the questions that has come in is very important in a local context, and I think it's important that we look at place-based issues as well as things that are just happening in the current environment. But lastly, what I want to ask, and we can keep these answers relatively brief, just in terms of anything you might suggest. But that question is, how can public administrators ensure that intersectionality is included as part of their work? And Frankie, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Well, I would say, you know, it took years to build this thing. We call it now structural inequality. And it's going to take years to unbuild it. So take the time, as Belinda was saying, is like, talk to those you serve. Actually invite them and co-create those tables and invite them to those decision-making, you know, whatever that table looks like. Provide those resources so that they can actually, you know, those you serve can actually make decisions about the very things that you're doing in your institution or your organization. And nobody wants to do that because it's like, oh my God, this just takes too much time. Well, gosh, I mean, you know, 200 plus years, that's a lot of time too, right? So it's like, invest your time. You've got to be able to see that it's worth something, that it's valuable. And so how do you, you know, really work with those you serve to think about, well, what is it that we do? How are we doing it? And where are the resources to undo it? And so I would say, as a, you know, public administrator, like, how do you really incorporate those processes into your work? And that you're not always like this, because that has gotten us where we are today. Nowhere. And so again, what is that process for empowerment and how do you do it? There's not one answer. There's a lot of ways of doing it. Find that way. Build it out. Maintain it over more than just, you know, 6 months or a year. Have it as an integral part of your organization's strategic plan. And then put some metrics to it. Did we do what we say we were going to do? Not just, you know, check box, pat ourselves in the back. No, you know, let's measure ourselves. Did we say we, you know, if we do what we say we were going to do, and how did we do? You know, how do you selves really accountabilities? How do we keep ourselves accountable to what we say we were going to do? And that process is, I would say, start there. That is really important.
I like that a lot. I think accountability is important. And I think the metrics, the way we use data in and around this topic, in and around people of color and the various identities that encapsulate who we are as intersectional beings, absolutely, I agree with that 100%. Belinda, let's toss it over to you. How can public administrators ensure intersectionality is included as part of their work?
I definitely appreciate what Frankie just said, and I agree wholeheartedly. We have to get the metrics in there. We have to get into that community. And we also have to do something else that I found very interesting in being in this lay of the land in this area. We have to show these communities how they intersect together, because we have these Black communities, transgender communities, Latinx community, and all these communities, they're vying for things that they need. And they don't see a lot of times the intersectionality, that the support that we can give them and how they intersect. So it's definitely helping communities get what they need, but linking them together too, to give them the strength and the understanding that data doesn't usually lie. When we get numbers that are real, that's what people believe in. And my white brothers and sisters definitely believe numbers. I had someone recently who was a very well-established white man tell me, bring it to me in numbers. and then this is what I'll do for you. And that is really true. People need to see those numbers, but we also have to get our communities engaged to see the benefit of them uniting and linking together to hold us, organizations, government, accountable to get everybody what they need. Because I will say this, because I know I got to be quick. We build these systems and we keep everybody at odds for some of the same things, and we don't show them what the power would be if they acknowledge that, hey, we all have very similar struggles. I'm not trying to tell your story, as Frankie said, but our stories are looking real similar. How are we going to hold these people accountable and let them know we're working in solidarity and we're working together to get what all our communities need? So definitely getting in them, getting in those communities, acknowledging, and also remember something you said, Doctor, at the very beginning. Every time we create these systems, we leave somebody out. So every time we look to improve these systems, we got to go back and pick up the pieces and get them included. Give ourselves grace. No, we're leaving people out, but go back and intentionally seek to bring them in. So the more work we do, the better bridge we build, the wider we make it, and the more platforms people can get in. They say we got a glass ceiling, forget the ceiling, let's expand the width.
Amazing. Thank you, Belinda. That was great. Anthony, Dr. Starke, we're going to give you the last go around for this question. How can public administrators ensure intersectionality is included as part of their work? And following your response, we'll head to the audience.
I'll just be very brief because I think that my fellow panelists have done an amazing job of covering this. I'll just say, in addition to what they've already said, is that we need to be vehement, right? One of the things that we recognize about social structures and about institutional oppression and structural racism and all of the different inequities that we experience is that oppressive systems do not simply appear and they do not simply disappear, right? Rather, they evolve to fill the space of society and its laws allow. And so we need to be very vehement as we are making changes that we believe are in the best interest of one group. We have to be vehement to see the ways in which those changes, those laws, those policies, those actions may disenfranchise other groups. And so this is it's a collective struggle, right? And so as Belinda mentioned, you know, we have to be able to see the ties that bind us. And I think that requires us being vehement, because these things, these oppressive systems are nefarious, they are omnipresent, and they are always at work in our society around us. And so we need to be thinking that although, and I think that's what intersectionality does for us, right? It allows me to see the areas in which I am both oppressed and privileged. And sometimes when we make those decisions, we're making them from a place of privilege. We don't necessarily see how our privilege is oppressing other people. And so it's very important that we remain vehement, that we remain empathic, that we think about others and the effects that our decisions, that our actions have on folks not like ourselves.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Anthony. That was great. Okay, so we've gotten a couple of questions in the chat, really great questions. We will try our best to get to all of them because I think they're all important. The first one that I want to address is that local issue that I've been thinking of, that I think a lot of people in the area have been thinking of. Former 9 News reporter Lori Lizarraga penned a recent write-up about her experience at 9 News, and I'll just go ahead and read this question verbatim because it speaks to the greater issue. The question says, recently 3 brave Latinas wrote and published about their experience of racism and inequalities at 9 News. How do you fight back in a toxic workplace setting and be true to your values? Do we just quit? And how do we handle microaggressions? So who would like to start?
Well, I can. It's interesting because it takes me back to there was another question about, you know, the burden of BIPOC people taking up the mantle of equity. And I think when people see us that way, I think these microaggressions, they come, you know, fast and furious because we're an easy target. And I think that there's a lot of other reasons why a workplace can be toxic, for sure. But when these things all collide, right, and all these isms, you think about, you know, pay parity, promotions, right, all these things that people are, you know, because at the end of the day, I mean, for me, equity, one of the things that it does, it's a path to wealth building. right? I mean, we as people of color should not be ashamed of like, you know what, we want to advance our careers. We want to strengthen economically our communities. That's not something we should shy away from. But I think that, you know, as people of color, yeah, it is a burden. And will our institutions ever stop saying, well, you're brown or you're black, I think you know, or you're Asian, I think you know something, right? And I think that I would say one of the ways to address that is like I talked with when I say, Belinda, you are a superwoman, is that you've got to find that support. And sometimes it's outside of your organization. And you've got to think about like, okay, you know, you got to find a place to nurture yourself, because it's a fight that's going to go on for a very long time. And so where are those places, not just for empowerment, but truly nurture that, you know, Anthony talked about Black love, you know, it's like, where are those places where we can see ourselves and we can just love ourselves? Because this is not going away. And so for me, like, how do I deal with microaggressions or a toxic workplace? It's like, I go to those people who I trust and who are going to constantly build me and remind me, like, you know, you've got to keep going. You don't have the option to stop. Because I do recognize that, like Anthony says, I have a certain amount of privilege. I may grow up poor, you know, my father went to the 5th grade, my mother went to the 2nd grade, but I'm still better off than they are. And so, but it's still my responsibility to take on the work. And in terms of the toxic workplace and the microaggressions, it's kind of like, I mean, I've sometimes I've been super direct, right? Sometimes it's worked, most of the time it doesn't, but it's who I am. That whole thing about authenticity, well, that's who I am. And sometimes you're like, I'm just going to say what I need to say, you know, and there are consequences. I recognize that there are consequences, and it has affected my career trajectory, but that's how I stay true to my values. And it's always a balancing act. It really is. You know, think of what's the battle and what's the war, what's the difference, and where do I contribute when?
Absolutely. Thank you. And with regard specifically to the 9 News issue, it was also heartening to see that we had a growing cadre of lawmakers. For example, folks like State Senator Julie Gonzalez, Councilwoman Amanda Sandoval, and a variety of other elected Latina leaders that stepped in and held 9 News to account to ask why Lori and her other colleagues did not have contracts that were renewed. When we say that representation matters, it matters in every single facet of life. It matters in our workplaces here. It matters at the university where Anthony and I work, and it matters in the news. Stories that affect us and the people who report on them matter a great deal. So that question was very key. Let me pivot to another question. And Belinda, I'm going to direct this one specifically to you because it invokes some of what you said earlier in your comments. A very thoughtful question here. It says, today there seems to be an overwhelming burden on a few people to continue to tell the story of intersectionality, push for equity, and to constantly ask the tough questions about established systems. Given the spirit of intersectionality, knowing that you can be both a leader and, to Belinda's point, have your own needs, how can organizations or institutions not become over-reliant on BIPOC and LGBTQ leaders to advance equity in the workplace or in their work?
I think that is a wonderful question, and I think it's an impactful question. I definitely see that we can do that by continually being kind and vigilant to educate our non-BIPOC, LGBTQ community, and other disenfranchised communities. Let me tell you why. Because if I can get somebody who has $1 million to buy in and invest in something they say they believe in, they will be one of my best promoters. Even though they're investing the money for it, they're promoting what they believe in. And when we get our white brothers and sisters involved in the work that we do, it gets to take away some of that burden. But also, we need to remind our white brothers and sisters that we are not the walking billboards for every injustice, inequality. And even though we're the subject matter experts, we have to take care of ourselves. It goes back to what Anthony said and what Frankie said. We have to be mindful because, again, these systems were strategically created to keep us oppressed in the first place. And one of the oppressions, with Frankie's standpoint, is money. They tell us it's not about money. Why people leave organizations? Yes, they do. They leave organizations because of bad management and money. That's the only reason I've ever left an organization. Two, people want to keep you disenfranchised from taking your self-care, where little Susie can go and take off when she needs to take off. But this work that I'm doing is so impactful in the community and the work that I do. I need to go take a mental health day too. So it's about calling things what they are, sharing the responsibility, and also letting people know that even though you're there, you're willing to be kind, vigilant, and educate. It is not your job to do their work and to get other people outside of our communities to buy in. And it also helps us to support one another, even though we may have our communities transcend one another. We have some very strong similarities. It helps me support my sister in Latinx community to say, wait a minute, you know what? Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's give this to someone else to work on right now, because you need to take care of yourself. Because there are certain things in these communities that we can identify, that we can help support when it comes to the self-care, the inequalities, that even though we may not look identically the same, we're faced with the same barriers. And that's why it's more strength and powers in numbers. So get our colleagues that don't look like us to buy into this work we do. And let's just be real. I'm gonna say this because I know I have to get off. White America does not look at us the same as they look at what we say coming out of somebody's mouth. And that is the truth. And we know that. If that was not the truth, the inequities and the systems that were created on paper that have been enacted and that are law and continue to be law and continue to be returned and just reworded would not have the impact that it has today. Once again, these structures were never created for people who look like any of us. For the LGBTQ population, none of that. So we have to get buy-in from others who do not look like us, but who are bought in to the very fabric that humanity is more important than one person's agenda.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Belinda. I'm going to toss this last question out. I'm going to direct it to Anthony if I can. Because I think it's a good note to close on. I think you and I, as professors, but it goes well beyond the professoriate, well beyond academia. It permeates every space in our working lives. The question is a good one. What is the best way to invite our population served to have a seat at the table, particularly when wanting to be mindful of existing time and resource constraints? How do we make these invitations easy and appealing rather than another burden or obligation?
I love this question. I wasn't just talking about the other question, but I do love this question because it reminds me of a similar question that I received just this past Friday from that panel that I was referring to, where a doctoral student was asking, how do you incorporate social equity into your research agenda? And my answer was social equity issues and concerns are always there. It's not about going out and finding the social equity issues and concerns in your work. It's about uncovering those things and making them a part of the centerpiece of your work. And I think in the same way, we have to recognize that that is part of this work, right? Like there's this understanding that the injustices are always there, the recognizing that you need to take self-care, and all those things are important, but also realizing that this is very much so a part of the system that you're working in, right? And so being able to, as Belinda said, call and name those things. One of the things that I thought with that last question is that silence serves no one. Systems are designed to exploit labor from individuals. And so as you think about the ways in which you're engaging in this work, the ways in which you are trying to invite people, don't think of it as an extra task that you need to do. There are always going to be barriers that are excluding folks. There are always going to be points of access that allow those with privilege into these conversations. And so as opposed to thinking about how do I work through these things and how do I do this additional task, I would say recognize that it's already there, that it should be embedded as part of the work that you're doing, and recognizing too that it is, I mean, we're talking about a marathon here, right? We're not talking about a sprint. As Frankie mentioned earlier, you know, it took 200 years to build these systems. And so thinking about deconstructing these systems, I don't necessarily think you're going to walk into a room in every single meeting and be in the position to say, okay, who's not here? How do we get those folks here? But at least when you're in those meetings, start thinking about who is not here, what perspectives are missing, and how do we begin to incorporate those things. I think for each group, for each meeting, think for each discussion, that's going to look different. But part of your responsibility is, again, not looking for the extra burden of inviting those folks who have been excluded, but actually thinking about the structures that are already in place and how do you maneuver and change and make the necessary adjustments so that those perspectives can be included. And so think of it as, yes, it's part of your work, but at the same time, it's part of the necessary work, right? That every time you walk into a space, you're not going to walk into any space that I can think of where every perspective is going to be included. And so it's you're chipping away step by step as you're thinking about doing this work. And so what that looks like in terms of the way that you convene folks is very different. One of the things that I have to be very mindful of are the social norms that different cultures, that different groups have in place, and the ways in which they choose to engage, or the ways in which they have been allowed to engage in the past have really shaped the ways in which they engage in the present. And you have to be knowledgeable of that so that you can begin to make the necessary alterations and the systems that you find yourself in. And so thinking about those things and putting yourself in someone else's shoes to recognize that they may not feel comfortable, again, being the token in that space, right? Like you don't want to invite somebody into a space and say, okay, speak for all people that look like you. Instead, you want to be able to include them in a way that is empowering to them, that is listening to them, that is bringing forth their ideas into the space in a way that is collaborative so that everyone can benefit from their contributions and not just those that look like them, right?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anthony. Dr. Starke, you have been a tremendous force for us here at the university. You've been an important voice on this panel, along with Belinda and Frankie. It's been an honor to moderate this discussion with you. It's been enriching, and I appreciate everything that you've contributed, the strength and the individuality and the authenticity of each and every one of your voices in talking about intersectionality today. So just my personal thanks to all of you for being with us here, for being guests of the School of Public Affairs and for this series. And we want to thank everybody who has attended. We apologize that we were not able to get to every single question, but our hour is up. And in true professor fashion, we are running over time a little bit. But I want to say thanks and give anybody an opportunity to make their parting thoughts as we cycle off the call. Danielle is back with us. I'll go ahead and turn my time back over. But thank you again for joining us today.
Yes, thanks everyone so much. This unprecedented year has demonstrated in many ways the importance of continually to strive for social equity while performing the work of public administration. The Social Equities series premise was to bring both practitioners and academics together to discuss how social equity is conceptualized and then applied. Mary Guy, the author of the book Achieving Social Equity, showcased in part 1 how many social injustices are prevalent in the facets of our world. In part 2, the philanthropic practices of an international nonprofit inspired us to reflect on how to give without thrusting our ideas and ideologies upon the organization's operation. Lastly, today we dove into the concept of intersectionality and how it's portrayed in the work of public administration. On behalf of the AMPA cohort at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado in Denver, we would like to thank all the presenters here today and throughout the Social Equity series. We have been inspired by the work you do and the wisdom you have shared with us. Thanks to everyone who has attended the Social Equity series. Together, we are creating a socially equitable future. And with that, all the best, take care, and again, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.